25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester has become one of the most infamous addresses in Britain. For 20 years, Fred and Rose West quenched their appetite for sex and murder inside this house of unimaginable horror. When police began investigating the disappearance of their daughter, it led them right to the West front door. Detectives were only just beginning to unearth the murderous history of Fred and Rose West.
It was on a scale that was really unprecedented.
Children are their things to play with. They are disposable. They're things there to be used and abused.
I've never for one moment doubted that Frederick West was a truly evil man. But he found in Rose the perfect sorcerer's apprentice.
This is the story of how Fred and Rose West became two of the world's most evil killers. Fred and Rose West are one of the most notorious couples in British history. For 2 decades, they sexually abused, tortured and murdered 9 women, including their own daughter, in their house of horrors. And between them were responsible for another 3 victims buried around Gloucestershire. When the news broke in February 1994, the media were only scratching the surface of the couple's terrifying life behind the closed door of 25 Cromwell Street.
5 days and nights into their excavation, and forensic teams have now unearthed 3 sets of human remains, all buried in separate places, 5 feet under the garden patio of this Gloucester home.
It's horrible to think that there are, dead bodies in a garden just down the road. It's just thoroughly disgusting. I mean, it's horrifying to think.
Totally shocking, especially around, in Gloucester. I mean, you wouldn't expect this to happen.
But Fred and Rose's horrifying story began many years before. In 1969, 28-year-old Fred West was married to his wife Rena with a young family of his own. But he had his eye on a 15-year-old girl named Rosemary Letts. Rose and her family had recently moved to the Gloucestershire area, whereas Fred was born and raised in the local village of Muchmarcle.
Well, Fred was the eldest boy in the family, and he was very much the target for quite a lot of abuse at the hands of his mother. So his mother sexually abused him, essentially, and he lost his virginity to her. And the family was a very self-contained one. Rose's childhood was similar to Fred's in many ways, in that it was completely dysfunctional and antisocial and abnormal. So she was abused by her father, who started raping her from a very young age. So what she took to be normal, what she took to be acceptable in terms of behaviour within a family really was anything but.
Fred pursued Rose. He was used to getting what he wanted. When the couple met, there was instant attraction.
Rose lived in the same village that Fred had a caravan. They met at the bus station in Cheltenham. She said that he could charm the birds off the trees, even though his appearance was shabby. He had not very clean teeth.
Well, these were 2 incredibly damaged people. They'd both come from abnormal families. And I think when they met, what they saw in each other was something familiar. So they both would have realised that the childhoods that they had were far from normal. But with one another, they felt that familiarity.
Maybe it was something that Rose gave off implicitly, but something in Fred connected with what had happened to Rose and the way she was and the way she'd been treated by her father. And it was like a union of 2 souls.
I think it was the perfect storm. The chances of these 2 people meeting was, it must have been a million to 1, but unfortunately they did.
By 1970, just a year after meeting, they were living together in Gloucester with Fred's stepdaughter Charmaine. His wife Rena was nowhere to be seen. Rose was pregnant with the couple's first daughter, Heather.
I think in the early days, perhaps the more dominant partner was Fred. He was older, he was more experienced, he'd seen more than Rose had. She'd come from this incredibly contained family. But I think as their relationship developed, she started to find her feet and find her confidence. And I don't think that Fred ever really trusted her.
For Rose and Fred, it was all about sex from the very, very beginning. Fred was the originator, but he found the perfect sorcerer's apprentice, the perfect partner, someone who shared his lust and someone who understood him and wanted to perform for him.
I think we have a lot of trouble making sense of Fred and Rose's relationship, and the reason for that is because we are people with emotions and normal feelings and ideas of what acceptable and unacceptable boundaries are around relationships. So I don't think I'd describe their relationship as a loving one.
Fred and Rose's traumatic childhoods had a lasting effect on the couple and their twisted approach to family life together.
It's always a very complicated question to answer how many children Fred and Rose actually had, because if you count Fred's daughter Charmaine along with Fred and Rose's 8, it's 9. But then you've got to add Rose's 3 mixed race children, all of whom were fathered not by Fred. All I would say is that all of them were deeply hurt, almost ruined by the parents.
I think Rose's early experiences within the family of being abused by her father wrote the script for what would later play out. So what she took to be normal, what she took as boundaries and rules really weren't going to work in the wider world. So what she was learning about in those early years would set her up to be somebody who didn't quite fit in.
And it was, to some extent, what Fred then adopted as a family habit. It was, if you like, a West tradition. I don't mean to say that that wasn't disgraceful, but it is nevertheless part of the family history and helps to explain something of West's behaviour.
2 decades later, it's 1992 and Gloucestershire police are searching for Heather West. In 1987, aged just 16, Fred and Rose's eldest child vanished from the family home. Fred had claimed Heather had run away, but she was never reported as missing. But after receiving allegations of child abuse at 25 Cromwell Street, detectives began to look into Heather's whereabouts. Chief Constable Tony Butler was in charge of Gloucestershire Police.
One of the children told a friend at school about what was happening to her. That friend talked to a patrolling police officer, in fact, about what her friend had told her, and it was a result of what the police officer then took that back, and it initiated a child protection process which led to the evidence being gathered.
5 of the West children were placed into care and the police began their investigations. They were interviewed about the darker side of their lives at 25 Cromwell Street.
What it brought to light was a family joke. And the family joke was a simple one. You better watch out, because if you don't shut up and stop causing your dad or your mum any trouble, you'll end up like Heather, 2 down and 3 across in the patio. Fred had laid a patio behind Cromwell Street, was in squares, which was rather like a crossword. The family joke was that he'd buried Heather at 2 down and 3 across.
This issue, this Heather's under the patio, continued to be raised. And so we started to take this point seriously. We knew Heather had disappeared, had left the home, so we tried to trace her. And despite massive amount of inquiry to try and find her, she just literally disappeared off the face of the earth.
In February 1994, the police decided to find out if the family joke was more serious than the children realised. Armed with a warrant, they began to dig under the patio of 25 Cromwell Street.
When they arrived with the warrant, Fred and Rose were at the house and they went into the back garden and the officers started digging the garden.
Sensing the end was nigh, Fred asked to be interviewed by police.
Fred asked the officer if they could go down to the police station, and so they left. Fred said that he admitted that Heather's remains were in the garden, but the police were looking in the wrong place. And later that day, he returned with the officers and he indicated where he thought Heather was buried. The following day, officers digging in that area recovered a femur, and that was taken for examination by the forensic pathologist, who confirmed it was human remains. And that turned out to be one of Heather's remains.
Rose was being questioned at Cheltenham Police Station when the news reached her and her solicitor, Leo Goatley.
When Rose was told that Heather's remains had been found, she gasped loudly and was very distraught. How do you interpret that? Was that a mother's shock and distress, or was it a murderer's distress at being found out? At that time, I believed that she was shocked and distressed, and that she didn't know the extent of Fred's activities. And of course, at that stage, it wasn't about serial killing, it was about Heather. But of course, the thing unravelled pretty quickly with the excavation.
The police found more than they'd bargained for under the patio at 25 Cromwell Street.
When they found remains, they found not just 2 legs or 2 thigh bones, but 3. The interrogating detective said to West, well, unless Heather had 3 legs, there's another body. Ah, yes, Fred says, without drawing breath or hesitating. That must be the other girl, that would be Shirley.
The police were about to unearth all the secrets that Fred and Rose West had been hiding at 25 Cromwell Street for over 2 decades. Secrets that would shock the entire nation. Fred told the investigating officers the other body was of his former lover, Shirley Robinson. Shirley hadn't been seen since 1978. When she disappeared, she was heavily pregnant with Fred's child. West also admitted that police would find a 3rd body in the garden, who he claimed was a friend of Shirley's. Throughout the questioning, he insisted on one thing, that his wife Rose knew nothing about any of the bodies.
I think when Fred was protesting Rose's innocence and taking the blame completely upon himself, I think, yes, at that point, the power had changed in their relationship, from him being the dominant one in the early years to her really putting the strings in those later years. And I think he really didn't trust her at this point in time. He was really quite afraid of what she might do. So I think that was definitely something that had flipped in this relationship.
Well, I found him quite a creepy bloke. He would always be trying to endear himself to people in a rather smarmy way, a little kind of giggle, making light of things. But he was very unconvincing doing that. And he would very quickly realise if you weren't impressed by him. And then he would withdraw, and I would sense there was this other side to him that would scowl and be probably quite nasty. Whatever his sort of murky machinations within his mind were, once he realised, he was probably better able to actually charm women than blokes. It's possible that, you know, with a little smile and some sort of soft talk, he was able to persuade some young women that he was safe to be around.
To make things more complicated, Fred's story kept changing. He alternated between admitting and denying the killings and told detectives that all the deaths were accidental. He wanted to get charged with manslaughter and not murder. It would be a hard job for pathologists to prove otherwise.
It's very difficult when somebody's been buried for years to look at them in detail as a pathologist. You haven't got the skin, you haven't got the muscles, you haven't got the organs, the things that you'd see injury or disease in. So you really have to comment on what may not be there. It makes the pathologist's job a lot harder.
Finding the cause of death was difficult, and so was identifying the 3rd victim buried under the patio. There were approximately 10,000 missing women recorded at the time. By using dental records, experts identified the 3rd victim as Alison Chambers, who was just 16 when she went missing in 1979, meaning she cannot have been a friend of Shirley Robinson, as Fred suggested. Marks found on her body proved beyond doubt she'd been tortured.
Someone's behaviour is more in the realm of psychology than pathology, but quite clearly there's potentially the aspect of torture there, potentially of sexual violence, and when a pathologist sees findings like that, we're looking away from manslaughter and more into some sort of act of cruelty.
This proved that West hadn't accidentally killed these young women. He'd tortured, sexually assaulted, and intentionally murdered them. But was Fred doing this without Rose knowing? The police weren't convinced.
The most important thing, of course, was that these bodies were recovered in the house that she shared with Fred. And it would appear inconceivable that she wouldn't have had knowledge of this.
The house itself was very, very small. It would have been inconceivable that you could have kept a young woman or women in that house without every occupant knowing that something was going on. No matter how much tape you would have put over their mouths, no matter how much they'd been concealed in the cellar, you would know. It would have been impossible not to know.
The police began to look into missing persons files to try and find any more potential victims. But with about 10,000 missing women in the country, it was a seemingly endless search.
Throughout that time, we were trying to trace people from children's homes to make sure they were safe. We were dealing with forensic materials, massive amounts of forensic material, searching. It was on a scale that was really unprecedented.
2 of the missing people stood out. Lucy Partington, a 21-year-old student last seen at a bus stop in Gloucester in 1973, and Linda Goff, a 19-year-old who went missing in the same year. Her last known address, 25 Cromwell Street.
Fred and Rose adopted a sort of modus operandi. They would identify young women on the run, if you like, run away from home, run away from a children's home, run away from their parents. They were vulnerable. They would offer them a home. And time after time, Fred would pick up with Rose, often at bus stops, young women who looked a little lost.
So they would always choose people who would be in that position of vulnerability. And the fact that they were a couple, I think, was quite helpful to them in luring victims in, because the women that they targeted would be more likely to trust a couple. So when they would pick somebody up who was hitchhiking, that played to that idea of, well, there's a woman there, so I'm going to be safe.
Rose already knew the language of grooming. She was quite used to it. And when you hear the victims talk about how she spoke to them in this sort of quite soft, pleasing voice, you knew that, again, that was something she'd learnt.
Linda Goff was never officially reported as missing, but her family searched for her at the time of her disappearance.
Linda Goff's mother, she'd been round to the house, knocked on the door, and it had been answered by Rose West. And she asked where Linda was, and she was told she'd gone away, I think, to Weston-super-Mare. She was struck by the fact that there was Rose standing there with her Linda's slippers, wearing Linda's slippers, and she also noticed on the clothesline there were articles of Linda's clothing.
Linda's mother believed Rose when she said her daughter had moved on from Cromwell Street, but as the press coverage began to reflect the sheer enormity of the unfolding story, other women who'd encountered the West came forward. The police got a break when Caroline Roberts contacted them to offer her help in the investigation. She'd seen the investigation on the news and revealed to police she'd been sexually assaulted by both Fred and Rose in 1972. She'd known them for a while after they picked her up while she was hitchhiking, and even worked for them as a nanny for a short time. It was one horrifying incident that caused her to lodge a complaint against them.
They invited her back to the house, and when she got to the house, having been assaulted in the car by Fred and Rose, she got back to the house and she was then bound and subject to some rather aggressive sexual activity. She managed to escape subsequently and reported it to her mum, who then told the police. Both Fred and Rose were arrested for rape and serious sexual offences.
At the time, she was scared to face them at a trial and ashamed at what had happened. The West were charged with indecent exposure instead of rape. They were fined £100. But with the information Caroline gave to the police, they could link Rose to the crimes and bodies at Cromwell Street.
So we had that evidence that there was an aggressive sexual nature to her personality. The details of sexual activity that had taken place had a number of similarities, particularly talking about bindings and gags and so on, that were very similar, if not identical, to the material that was recovered in association with the victims when they were discovered.
This case was much more about the accounts of people and what the survivors were saying than what the pathology can tell you. There are things that they could say that the bodies were no longer able to speak to, and that was a bigger element of this case than maybe the physical findings by the pathologist.
On March the 4th, 1994, police moved their search inside the house. They had a feeling that down in the dark cellar they may uncover even more bodies. On the same day, when news reached Fred West at Gloucester Police Station, he made a stunning admission in a handwritten note given to detectives. It read, "I, Frederick West, authorise my solicitor, Howard Ogden, to advise Superintendent Bennett that I wish to admit to a further approx 9 killings. Expressly, Charmaine, Rena, Linda Goff, and others to be identified. Signed, F. West."
Can you imagine the scene? It almost defies belief. They weren't sitting across the table from a monster, huge man with bare hands and able to kill a little insignificant chap, who nevertheless confesses to 9 murders. It's at that point the police realise, I think probably for the first time, that they are dealing with someone truly evil.
Fred was again taken back to the house and he indicated where some of the bodies had been buried, particularly the area of the cellar. And so what happened then was that we undertook a methodical search of the whole property. Fred maintained a position that Rose was not involved in these cases. You know, that's the inference, that he was trying to keep her out of it.
Fred took the rap for it. They had an agreement that she would stand by him and visit him, and he'd hoped to be out in so many years. But the minute Rose heard that he'd actually admitted to the murders, then she dropped him. He was gone. And she never spoke to him again. She absolutely refused to have any contact with him.
On March the 5th, 1994, the world's media had descended upon the home of Fred and Rose West in Gloucester. Police had exhumed 3 bodies from their back garden: their daughter Heather, Fred's pregnant lover Shirley Robinson, and missing teenager Alison Chambers. Now detectives were moving their search inside the property and began excavating the cellar at 25 Cromwell Street.
We started the excavations in the cellar. It was a difficult place to do excavations, and we had to be very careful about recovering the bodies. And on the first day we did find 2 sets of human remains. One turned out to be Teresa Siegenthaler, and the second remains were Shirley Hubbard.
It was clear to pathologists that much had been done to try and hide the identity of all the murdered girls.
With Fred and Rose as victims, one of their hallmarks, as it were, was that the fingers and toes were removed. I think we can hypothesise that there may be different reasons for that. Simple cruelty would be one, but obviously most people know that fingerprints are a very good way to identify somebody. So removing them, particularly in the 60s, 70s, 80s, before DNA technology was really recognised, would be a way to limit the chances of that person being identified.
And that was one of the big, one of our difficulties when we were doing the investigation, trying to identify the human remains, and in particular Teresa's remains, because there was no evidence she'd been anywhere near Gloucestershire. But we were able to, in liaison with the Metropolitan Police and the missing persons, to come down to a sort of a short list of people that it could be, and then through using forensic techniques we were able to be satisfied that we had identified her remains.
As the cellar excavation continued, officers escorted Fred to a field near his home at Muchmarcle. He told them if they dug there, they'd find the body of his first wife, Rena, not seen since 1971, a year after Fred and Rose had moved in together. Rena and Fred had been married for 9 years, but she was never reported missing.
So he was taken out to the fields, and he pointed out in one field, fairly close to a hedge line, where he said that he'd buried Rena Costello.
There were now 6 victims, and back in the cellar at Cromwell Street, even more bodies were being exhumed. Juanita Mott, a former lodger at the house, missing since 1975, and Carol Cooper, last seen walking home from the cinema in 1973. Plus 2 familiar names the police had been looking out for: Lucy Partington and, buried under the family bathroom, Linda Goff.
this was a tragedy for these young women. I mean, all murders are tragic for the victims and their families, but it was the scale of this, I think, that took the media's attention. I mean, it's almost incomprehensible that two people could abduct young women or lure them to their house and subsequently, sexually abuse them and then kill them. I mean, it is on a scale that's almost incomprehensible.
By the 8th of March 1994, less than 2 weeks after beginning their search at Cromwell Street, police had found 10 victims. Most of them had been buried 2 decades ago when Fred and Rose were at their most prolific.
Aside from the sexual element to the murders, they were becoming, I'd say, maybe closer in a way, but I don't know whether closer is the best word to use to describe that. I think they were becoming more cut off from the rest of the world. This was something that only the two of them understood. It was something that we refer to as a folie à deux, a madness shared by two. So I think it was kind of cementing their relationship.
They were to him no more than sexual implements, a kind of doll, if you like. I know it's a horrifying thought, but they had no more humanity for him than that. He was a man capable of absolutely no conscience and absolutely no remorse. And everything he did was with Rose's help. And the thought of having some young woman hung up in the cellar, literally, by her hands, and a hook for Fred and Rose to abuse when they wanted to, over a period of days, almost defies belief. It is that horrifying.
9 bodies had been exhumed from Cromwell Street and one more, that of Rena West, Fred's first wife, in a field near Muchmarcle. But Fred wasn't finished. Although he didn't admit to killing her, he told police he had a feeling that Rena's friend, Anne McFall, might be buried in a neighbouring field. She's believed to be Fred's first victim, killed in 1967 when she was 6 months pregnant.
As he did with all his killings, he dismembered the bodies before he buried them. So he didn't bury them in a skeleton, he buried them in a tube, if you like, in which the body was compressed, the torso, head separated, arms and legs separated and shoved into a smaller hole. It made the search for those bodies a very complicated affair.
The problem with Anne McFall's body was that the whole land had been re-landscaped, and so there was this topsoil that had been put on there. Now, when you're looking for human remains, you can't just bring a big digger in and shove it all out. You are literally doing it by spadefuls and sieving every spadeful. And we actually excavated a hole the size of an Olympic-sized swimming pool. We were almost giving up hope that we were going to find the body, and we set a deadline for ourselves that if we didn't find them by date X, then we would stop. But fortunately, a couple of days before that deadline came in, we found some bones and then subsequently recovered the body.
During the 2 months of digging for Anne McFall's remains, the police had arrested and charged Rose West with murder. For each victim, she claimed, "I'm innocent." The police's evidence was circumstantial, and defence lawyers felt there wasn't enough to connect her to the murders.
Rose West said, "I had nothing to do with this." And the Crown are saying, well, we've got a statement from so-and-so who says that you were involved in an abduction and sexual abuse. Well, to a point you say, well, so what? What's that got to do with murder? Fred had said in his interviews, he fully admitted them and said Rose had nothing to do with them. So the first point is to say, well, what is the strength of the case against Rose? She's denying it. Where's the proof that she was involved?
While police continued their search at Cromwell Street, they also turned their attention to a second address, 25 Midland Road, Fred and Rose's first home together in Gloucester. Investigators believe that somewhere in the house or garden they might find the body of Charmaine West, Fred's stepdaughter from his marriage to Rena. An extensive search began.
At the time of Charmaine's death, she was living at 25 Midland Road, a house that subsequently Fred and Rose had left. But we went to the house and, again, excavating under the floor of the kitchen, we found Charmaine's body.
Charmaine hadn't been seen since she was 8 years old in 1971 and hadn't been reported as missing. In the same year, Fred was in jail for 9 months for motoring offences and stealing fence panels from his then employer. The police were convinced they'd finally got a breakthrough. They were confident Charmaine must have been murdered by Rose while Fred was serving time.
Rose was jealous of Charmaine. Charmaine was a very bright little girl, and I think Rose could see that she was getting the upper hand of her, and she didn't like it. The younger sister knew to keep quiet. It was best not to antagonise Rose, and Charmaine was quite a feisty little girl.
So there were slight differences in the modus operandi. You know, certainly with the others, you can imagine Fred going about his work with a sort of builder's precision and routine, you know, severing the limbs and the head, digging a hole in the ground and placing them in it. Charmaine was different. Nevertheless, Fred was charged with Charmaine, even though there were, from the outset, issues about whether Fred was present or whether he was in prison. So there was always that slightly nebulous issue about how old precisely Charmaine was and the dates when she died.
With the high-profile trials imminent, the police had to somehow prove that Rose West was just as guilty as her husband Fred. But before they got a chance, there was a major setback in their case. In December 1994, 10 months after police had begun to search 25 Cromwell Street for Heather West, the bodies of 12 young women had been unearthed across Gloucester. Fred West was thought to be responsible for all of the deaths, and police were desperately trying to find some evidence to prove that his wife Rose was implicit in 10 of the murders. Both had been arrested, charged and were awaiting trial, but on January the 1st, 1995, Fred West took his secrets to the grave.
Fred was in custody at Winson Green Prison in Birmingham, and on the 1st of January 1995, he was found dead in his cell. He died from hanging, and it was subsequently determined that he committed suicide.
Fred West was always a cunning man. He planned his suicide as carefully as he concealed his bodies. He groomed the prison officers into thinking that he was an absolutely safe, harmless little man who could do no wrong and was very happy to collaborate with anything they wanted. Indeed, he volunteered. He said, "I'll mend shirts. Don't worry, give me something to do. Be a pastime for me while I'm waiting for my trial." Painstakingly, over a period of weeks, he stitched together a rope, partly from bits of the blanket on his bed, partly from pieces of shirt, very carefully, because he had decided that he was not going to trial and that he was not ever going to confess the true extent of what his crimes amounted to.
There was a total loss of control by Fred over Rose. I've no doubt about that. She made it abundantly clear she wanted absolutely nothing else to do with him, and she blanked him in the dock. Independent of his relationship with Rose, he lacked empathy with people. You know, people were objects to be used and abused. The fact of the matter was, he knew the game was up. He'd made the admissions, the remains had been found, the terrible story of those victims unfolded.
For those who knew the West family, this is just another macabre twist in a story that first came to light 10 months ago. In the words of one neighbour, if Frederick West really did kill himself, then it seems almost appropriate that a man accused of taking so many people's lives should end up taking his own.
Fred's suicide was a huge problem for the police. It put the entire case in jeopardy.
With the death of Fred, we were concerned that the press might feel, well, the case against Fred is now finished, and therefore we can disclose information because the case is closed. That would have been a disaster for us because it would have then compromised the trial of Rose West.
The police were desperate. While Fred had confessed to 11 of the killings, Rose had always claimed her innocence. Without any solid evidence, there was a real chance that Rose West was going to get away with murder.
I think it's the Crown that need to review their case and decide where they want to take it from here.
I would hope that they will drop the case.
I thought it was possible the case might have been dropped. There were a lot of eminent observers suggesting that would be the case. The DPP had a different view, though. And in fact, the case got worse against Rose. They added on the murder of Charmaine, which prior had been a sole charge in relation to Fred. I thought that was very curious. Rose thought the case was going to go away as well, but it didn't.
Prosecutors needed proof that Rose alone was responsible for the death of her stepdaughter Charmaine. They turned to forensic odontologist Professor David Whittaker.
The police brilliantly discovered, I don't know how, that a certain newspaper, national newspaper, had acquired a set of negatives, and they were large professional negatives, and they showed incredible detail in some of the baby teeth, the deciduous teeth of Charmaine, which I was then able to match exactly using our facial superimposition technology, and showed that they matched exactly in terms of tilt and position and grooving and little rough edges that were a perfect match. But the position of the teeth had moved. So, if we could calculate that movement and assess it, of being able to determine, within reasonable accuracy, the time elapsed between the photograph being taken, which the police had a date for, it was written on the negatives, and the time of death. And if that fitted into the slot where Fred West was in jail, then clearly Mrs. West had a lot of questions to answer.
On the 3rd of October 1995, the world's press flocked to Winchester Crown Court to report on one of the most sensational trials of modern times.
Rose's trial attracted worldwide attention, as you would expect. It's very rare for a woman to go on trial, let alone for 10 murders. I attended it from the first day to the last. It was an extraordinary event.
As the trial began, Rose West pleaded not guilty to all 10 counts of murder, the 9 girls found buried at Cromwell Street and Charmaine. But the evidence against her was irrefutable.
So in court, in front of Rosemary West, I had all the technology available to reproduce the imaging of Charmaine. Dreadful thing to have to do in court, but the judge and the prosecution insisted. So Mrs. West actually saw this imaging developing in front of her. And I think it was about the only time she looked a little bit upset.
She marched into the witness box like a very angry traffic warden. Plain shoes, weighty woman, angry demeanour. This is all an outrage. It was all Fred. I had nothing to do with it. I knew nothing. It was completely inconceivable I could have done this. I couldn't have killed my own daughter. A tissue of lies.
We think of Rose West as this woman in the courtroom, in her 40s, great big glasses that she wore, quite a frumpy housewife looking. Those murders had happened a long time before then. She was actually very young when she committed the murder. She was, in fact, a teenage serial killer because she'd committed 3 murders before she was 20, and most of the murders were over by the time she was 26.
The evidence provided by Professor Whittaker convinced the jury that Rosemary West was guilty of all 10 murders.
He was able to say, and the jury accepted this, that he could pinpoint within a few days of when the child had been killed, and we had evidence that Fred was in jail during that time. So Fred could not have killed Charmaine at that time because he physically wasn't around, he was in jail.
I didn't think the trial had gone well for Rose, and the jury took quite a long time. It wasn't a 5-minute decision, it was many hours. They thought about everything very carefully. They came back and it was pretty well unanimous on everything. I mean, she was totally defeated.
When the first guilty verdicts came back, Rose did not flicker. Not a sign of emotion. She just simply stood there. There was no histrionics, no shouting, no screaming. There was no no sign of any emotion at all, really. And I was left with the overwhelming feeling that one had been in the presence of someone who had lost contact with humanity.
Sentencing her, the judge, Mr. Justice Mantell, recommended that Rose West should never be released. She was immediately returned to Holloway Prison.
Rose has never confessed to me. Whether she's made any kind of confession to anybody else, I don't know, but she certainly hasn't to me. I would say that tacitly, she, at various stages, gave the impression to me, with hindsight, that she knew that, you know, under the floor in Cromwell Street, there were a lot of secrets. That's slightly different to saying that she murdered people. But then the nature of the case, it was circumstantial.
300 miles from Gloucester, Rosemary West en route to the prison that will be home for a lifetime.
Today, Rose West is serving life imprisonment at Low Newton Prison in Durham. In 1996, a year after 25 Cromwell Street had given up its grisly secrets, it was demolished. In its place is now a public walkway, but nothing can erase the painful memories of Fred and Rose West and their house of horrors.
This certainly was a unique case in my experience, and I was involved as a detective investigating murders right back in the 1960s, and this is on a scale that's completely different. And I think in terms of its complexity, I think again it probably stands out as unique in criminal history. They were all young women who had their lives in front of them, and it was cut short for just brutal and selfish self-gratification of Fred and Rose.
I've never for one moment doubted that Frederick West was a truly evil man. I think he was born and bred. I think he only ever thought of himself. He was a psychopath and a sociopath. Had no concern for society, no concern for anybody but himself. But he found in Rose the perfect sorcerer's apprentice.
Many of us reflect on serial killer couples and say, well, if they had never met one another, would they have gone on to kill? We know that Fred had already committed one murder before he met Rose, so I think he would have killed again. When we look at Rose, I think she would have certainly gone on to harm other people, whether that was emotionally, financially, a non-physical kind of harm. But I think having Fred in her life opened up the door to a different kind of harm, a different kind of abuse.
I've never been in any doubt that Fred and Rose committed far more than 12 murders. I've always believed there were other victims, and they were buried in other places or concealed in other places. But to be fair to Gloucester Police, they can't dig up Gloucestershire in the effort to find more victims.
Speculation about other possible victims of Fred and Rose West will always remain. Theirs is a case whose shockwaves continue to reverberate around the world even today. The sheer depravity and the unimaginable terror of their victims is why we should remember them, not Fred and Rose and their house of horror. On June the 2nd, 1985, police were called to a lumber yard in San Francisco to apprehend a shoplifter. When they got there, the suspect, Charles Ing, had fled, but his partner, Leonard Lake, was still at the scene.
Lake and Ing are a dominant and subservient pair of lust killers. One having the lust fantasy, the other going along with the lust fantasy.
Leonard Lake was arrested. Then, in custody, he swallowed a cyanide pill and died before he could answer for his crimes.
Leonard Lake becomes obsessed with having women as his sex slaves, keeping women in an enclave.
Investigators soon discovered that Lake and Ing had a sinister secret. They were, in fact, a serial-killing duo with a hidden bunker where they kidnapped, raped, tortured and murdered men, women and children.
The horror that they go through when you actually see it on video, to actually see a woman begging for her baby and asking for her baby.
Serial-killing partners Leonard Lake and Charles Ing had carved their names in infamy as two of the world's most evil killers. It was a serial killing spree that horrified a nation and terrified the citizens of San Francisco, California. In just 11 months between July 1984 and June 1985, friends, neighbors, and entire families, women, men, and children, vanished without a trace. In that time, 11 innocent people were later proved to have been kidnapped and killed. Many were also tortured and raped by the serial killing pair Leonard Lake and Charles Ng.
Teen serial killers make up around a quarter of the serial murder cases in the US. But the difference with Ng and Lake is that this particular serial killing team got away with a lot of murders before they were apprehended.
The MO was this. They would answer an ad in a paper. Usually the ad was for some merchandise that they needed. They would kidnap whoever was selling the merchandise, take the merchandise, use the woman for their sexual pleasure. They would make her a slave, and whoever the man was that was with her would be summarily killed.
When investigators searched the killer's cabin in the northern Californian woods, they found what they thought to be the remains of at least 11 corpses that had been buried in shallow graves. Ed Erdulatz was with the San Francisco Police Department at the time.
I spent 23 years of my career in homicide, worked a lot of murder cases, but this is right at the top of the list of being one of the most difficult to deal with personally.
These two were incredibly cold. They really didn't care. And the way that they treated their victims, they humiliated them, they tortured them. This was what they thought was fun.
The story of the serial killing duo began just over 70 years ago in 1945. The elder of the pair, Leonard Lake, was born in the wake of World War II. Lake had a troubled childhood.
His family have got a history of working in the US Navy. They move around a lot. There's quite a lot of volatility in the family unit, quite a lot of drinking.
Age 6, Lake's parents separated, and he and his siblings were sent to live with their grandparents. There, his grandmother allegedly encouraged some lewd behaviour.
He, as a boy, had been encouraged by his grandmother to take naked pictures of his sisters. And I think that this gave him this fixation that meant that he was always, to some extent, wanted to manipulate women.
As a young man, Lake developed his own unhealthy urges.
Leonard Lake identified with a book by John Fowles called The Collector, which was written in 1963. And basically, the story of The Collector was a clerk called Frederick Clegg. He collected butterflies. And for some reason, suddenly developed a fixation on a girl called Miranda, and decides to abduct Miranda so that she becomes part of his butterfly collection.
Lake becomes obsessed with having women as his sex slaves, keeping women in an enclave that he's going to develop because he's going to survive a nuclear Armageddon.
In 1965, aged 19, Lake joined the US Marine Corps and served 2 tours in the Vietnam War as a radar operator.
I think it tipped him over the edge, the possibility that he would find himself in close combat fighting, and essentially snapped. And that was the genesis of the man that became really a ferocious killer.
In 1971, Lake was diagnosed with schizoid personality disorder and was given a medical discharge. He re-emerged in San Francisco, where he began to explore his dark fantasies.
He married in San Francisco in 1975. His wife finally couldn't stand him because he made amateur porn films. A lot of sadomasochism, a lot of bondage. His wife was very upset by that and effectively threw him out.
In 1977, still in the San Francisco Bay Area, Lake met his second wife. Nicknamed Cricket, she indulged his peculiar habits.
Cricket was an active participant in his, again, amateur porn films and appeared in many of them.
This is the thing about abusive men like Leonard Lake. They're not abusive all of the time. They're able to charm, they're able to manipulate, they're able to spin a good story to people who they want to support them.
15 years younger, Charles Ng seemed an unlikely choice for a friend.
Charles Ng was born in Hong Kong in 1960, the son of a wealthy Chinese businessman, a harsh disciplinarian. One of Ng's releases was to be a kleptomaniac. He stole things. He stole things because it made him feel better about himself. And he did it repeatedly.
Aged 15, Ng was sent to a boarding school in England, but it did not go well.
Charles Ng's family were consistently embarrassed by him, so he was moved around from school to school. He ended up at a boarding school in Yorkshire, where he carried on with this behaviour. He did academically well for a while, so he was a child who was quite bright. But he just couldn't help himself in terms of stealing and create all of this chaos, and I think he was quite enjoying that.
In 1978, aged 18, Ng moved to the US on a student visa. He moved to California to study, but he soon got into trouble again. He was involved in a hit and run. In October 1979, aged 18, Charles Ng was arrested and forced to pay for the damages. Then, in a strange twist, a year later, the Hong Kong resident and British citizen lied about his nationality and joined the US Marine Corps. But less than a year after he joined, old habits resurfaced.
In 1982, when by this time Ng was 22, he was arrested for stealing explosives and weaponry.
Ng was sentenced to 14 years in military detention in Hawaii. It was while he was in jail that Ng formed an uncommon friendship with Leonard Lake.
Ng was in military detention and he was reading a magazine, and there was an ad in this magazine Leonard Lake had placed in there, and he responded to this ad. So it was a real chance encounter. And you wonder, had he not have been reading that particular magazine, had he have been in a different place, that these two would never have come together. But they did meet and they wreaked absolute havoc.
Lake's post, advertising weapons he had for sale, appeared to have been the basis of their friendship.
As is so often the case, weapons are a fascination to many people, many of whom have a sense of insecurity. They feel that weapons give them a sense of power. So I think that what really linked the two was a fascination with weapons.
The details are murky, but somehow Ng stayed in touch with Lake, who became a mentor for the young would-be killer.
I think what Ng found in him was a kind of surrogate father, someone who would understand him. He was suggestible enough to fall under the spell of a man of a stronger, older disposition, which Lake certainly was.
Charles Ng managed to escape from military detention in early 1983.
And the one person he deserted to run away to was Lake, who was living at this point in a mobile home in Northern California.
However, the net was closing in. An FBI SWAT team arrived by helicopter, raided the mobile home, and arrested Charles Ng. They made a discovery that would also get Lake arrested: illegal firearms. But Lake was freed on bail and then went into hiding in California. His friend Ng was sent to the US State Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. After serving 18 months, he was dishonorably discharged and released in 1984. That same year, the two friends reunited. Charles Ng moved into Lake's new remote ranch in the northern Californian wilderness.
It was the combination of the two individuals that made them into the terrible killing machine that they became.
Here, Lake and Ng shared their depraved fantasies, and together they devised a fearsome plan to murder men, women, and even infants on an industrial scale. On the grounds of the 2-acre property, Lake had built a subterranean bunker for his and his partner Ing's murderous purpose.
In Calaveras County, east of San Francisco, where, effectively, Lake set up the dungeon that he'd always wanted for his Operation Miranda, where Ing came to join him.
Based on Lake's obsession with the book The Collector, the pair teamed up to put Leonard Lake's fearsome fantasy, his so-called Miranda plan, into motion.
The Miranda plan was the means by which he was going to be the one who fathered all the new children in the world after the nuclear Armageddon had happened and he was in his enclave with all of his sex slaves.
That's what he was creating with Ing, and that's what he had been fantasizing for 20 years before he met Ing. The project's aim is to capture your ideal woman, enslave her, and have her be your sexual slave until you're done with her, at which time you kill her. In the case of Ing and Lake, the killings involve much more than killings, much more than just sex. They involve torture, they involve the photographing of victims. It was a nightmare that somebody from Hollywood could not dream up for a horror movie.
Ing arrives, and in a sense, they combust the fantasy because they start saying to each other, what we need is to have lots of children to repopulate the world and make better citizens, a kind of social engineering project through a very odd prism.
Ing was a very shy person who himself could not have done this, but happily joined the venture so that he would have a chance of the kind of sexuality his shyness made impossible.
On July the 25th, 1984, Lake and Ing's perverse Miranda plan was begun. The first woman they were thought to have abducted and enslaved was Deborah Dubbs. The duo would in fact murder her husband Harvey, and their 16-month-old son Sean. Answering an ad for video equipment, Lake and Ing showed up at their apartment in San Francisco. The pair likely killed Harvey and the baby soon after. Lake and Ing then kidnapped 33-year-old Deborah and took her back to their underground bunker.
In the case of the Dubbs family, they took all of their photographic equipment. Mr. Dubbs used to do photography work on the side. They abducted his wife and raped her.
In Wilseyville, in Calaveras County, Lake and Ing kept Deborah prisoner. In what would become their modus operandi, the callous killing team would torture, defile, and humiliate Deborah. They would subsequently subject all their female victims to the same awful acts.
The women are made to disrobe. They're told they will cooperate or they'll be killed.
They construct a one-way mirror so they can watch her. She is literally a specimen, which they can abuse, obviously rape, keep, and even more horrifying, they video it. They video her ordeal, subjecting her to an equally awful, degrading humiliation over a period of weeks.
The pair used a hog-tying technique to restrain their abductees.
Hog tying involves binding the ankles and binding the wrists and neck with somebody face down and their legs bent. So if they try and straighten their legs, it places pressure on the neck. So it is a vicious method of restraining somebody and extremely painful and extremely cruel.
Lake seemed to be the more domineering of the two.
It's clear that Lake is the one that's giving the instructions and telling Charlie what to do. And if Charlie doesn't do something quick enough, Lake kind of takes him to task. But Ing was a very willing participant.
I think Ing, he'd always had these sort of violent fantasies and he wanted to get involved in this kind of thing, and now he's able to, and he's got somebody to follow.
Lake and Ing are a dominant and subservient pair of lust killers. One having the lust fantasy, the other going along with the lust fantasy.
The pair derive great pleasure from the horror they were inflicting on the innocent.
Victims of kidnapping will often try and identify with their kidnappers. They'll try and develop a connection with them. They'll give them information about them. It was never going to work with Lake and Ing because they were emotionally turned off.
After weeks of torture, Lake and Ing shot and murdered Deborah.
Life means nothing. At that moment that the killing takes place, they can barely understand that this is a living person in front of them.
It plays to the deepest fears of every woman, that she's simply being subjugated, humiliated, used. She's simply there as a plaything of these two men. Eventually they tire and kill her.
But their lust for blood was not confined to enslaving, then murdering women for their Miranda plan. Lake and Ing also preyed on single men too. With Lake skipping bail and now in hiding, they would randomly kill men, then steal their money, their driver's licenses, and their identities. One such victim was 34-year-old Randy Jacobson. Unemployed, he had placed an ad to try and sell his van.
Most of the murders were committed in Calaveras, but most of the victims were from San Francisco. They were either kidnapped and taken up to Calaveras, or they were lured up there with a promise of work or some other incentive. And then they would kill them and murder them, and then began to collect their Social Security type benefits.
In October 1984, shortly after Leonard Lake answered his ad, Randy Jacobson vanished. Around the same time, 38-year-old Donald Giletti had answered an ad too. This time it was posted by Charles Ing and offered free sex. The San Francisco DJ responded, and he was later found murdered in his own home. He was shot 3 times. Donald's roommate would later identify Charles Ing as the killer. By the end of 1984, 6 months since the Miranda plan began, Ing and Lake's lust for murder knew no bounds.
Ing and Lake were just the worst possible two to ever get together. I think they fed off each other. I think they both enjoyed what they were doing. And I think their enjoyment by doing it together was actually increased exponentially.
Sometimes they get bored, so they start preying on their neighbours. So obviously these are people with families, with friends, with employers who are going to miss them, who are going to alert the authorities. But I think it's because they feel invincible at this point in time, and they think they're just going to keep getting away with it.
One of the things that they did that is extraordinary is before killing a woman, if the woman had connections, she had a job, she had a husband, they would have the woman in her own hand write a letter saying she was going away, taking a job in another city and wouldn't be coming back. And they sent it to the employer, the friend, the husband, so that they wouldn't know that she was actually missing and dead. This is the kind of careful planning that they did.
In April 1985, Lake and Ing needed another woman to satisfy their deviant desires and fulfill their Miranda plan. This time, the victims would simply be targets of opportunity. Their neighbour, Brenda O'Connor, her partner, Lonnie Bond, and their 1-year-old infant son, Lonnie Jr.
Bond and O'Connor and their son are presumably invited to Lake and Ing's cabin, and pretty speedily the two dispatch both father and infant son, kill them, and they make the girlfriend, Brenda O'Connor, a prisoner.
After weeks of torture, they murdered Brenda O'Connor. June the 2nd, 1985, San Francisco, California. For the last 11 months, Leonard Lake and Charles Ing had indulged their depraved fantasies. They included kidnap, rape, torture, and murder. But on this fateful summer's day, the pair walked into a lumber yard to buy supplies for their atrocious activities. when Charles Ing was caught stealing a table vise from the store, it would be the beginning of their end. The police were now involved.
Charles Ing goes on the run. He literally just abandons his partner in crime. It's all about his own self-preservation now.
Ing ran away. Lake stayed and tried to talk his way out of the shoplifting incident. And the South San Francisco police officer went to the car to recover the vice and also found a .22 pistol in the back.
They found that Leonard Lake's firearm was fitted with an illegal silencer. With their suspicions piqued, the police took Leonard Lake into custody.
Lake is now in a pretty fragile state, and I suspect realises that the whole thing is going to unravel.
As soon as they brought him in and he asked for a piece of paper and a pencil, and you're thinking as an investigator, maybe he's ready to sign a confession. So great, I'll go run and get him a piece of paper and a pencil. And then when you come back, he's dead on the floor.
What investigators did not know yet was that Lake had acted before his awful secret was discovered.
He did not want to go to the electric chair, and so Lake took the precaution of providing for himself cyanide pills in case he was ever captured, which he sewed into his jacket.
It's clear that Leonard Lake knew that he would kill himself when he got caught. He did all these terrible things, and he never wanted to stand up and face the consequences of them, so that he was ready and he had those cyanide tablets on him in the event he ever got caught.
Lake was dead, but his partner Ing was now on the run. The FBI and Interpol launched a national and international manhunt for Charles Ing. At the same time, they processed the license plate on the brown Honda that Leonard Lake had parked outside the lumber store.
After Leonard Lake kills himself, then they start kind of pulling on the string and everything starts unraveling.
Subsequently found out that the car had had switched license plate, and the car belonged to Paul Cosner. Paul Cosner was a man who lived in the Marina District in San Francisco, last seen alive when he purportedly left the house to show a prospective buyer of his car to take them for a test drive. And he was never seen again.
A forensic examination of the Honda revealed a single bullet hole in the roof at the front of the car. It was surrounded with a blood splatter. Investigators also found a driver's license belonging to yet another San Francisco man who had disappeared.
The missing persons detectives from San Francisco were immediately notified. They went down to South San Francisco, and Inspector Irene Brunn and Tom Eisenman. So at that time, there was still no involvement in homicide.
Inside the brown Honda, investigators also found a utility bill in Lake's ex-wife's name for a place in Calaveras County in Northern California. The detectives questioned her about the electricity bill found in the car. The interview led them to a ranch with a log cabin in the wilderness, 150 miles east of San Francisco. The detectives didn't know what they would find, but they were aware of a number of missing persons cases in the region. One in particular stuck in their mind.
At the time, there were a couple of missing persons cases that were kind of unusual. One was this Dubs family, a family of three, were missing under very strange circumstances.
As they walked through the cabin, they noticed a bed with holes drilled in the posts and on the floor, seemingly for restraints. But that's not all that detectives Irene Brunn and Tom Eisenman found.
Irene Brunn noticed a VCR and some other electronic equipment that she thought resembled equipment that was missing from the Dubs home. And she ran the serial number of a couple of those items, and sure enough, she got a hit. So she knew at that point, not only had she linked Lake and Ing to Paul Cosner in the car, but now she'd linked them into yet another missing person, the Dubs family.
Thought to be the first victims of their Miranda plan, the entire Dubs family had disappeared 11 months earlier, murdered by Lake and Ing. Evidence of wrongdoing was mounting, and then the case took an even darker turn.
Until the missing persons investigators got to the cabin, there was no connection to the Dubs family. So once that link was established, then there were a connection to 4 probably murdered people.
What had begun as a response to a shoplifting incident was now a mass murder investigation, with Leonard Lake and his partner in crime, Charles Ing, the prime suspects.
So at that point, the case was transferred from missing persons to homicide. And my partner, Jeff Brosh, and I ended up heading up a team of probably about 20 investigators from San Francisco.
On June the 5th, 1985, a team of San Francisco and Calaveras County investigators returned to the cabin in the woods. It was just 3 days since Lake had killed himself and Ing had gone on the run.
The police get to the cabin and they begin a series of absolutely horrifying discoveries.
Armed with a warrant, they searched a subterranean bunker or so-called fallout shelter situated next to the cabin.
And it was built into the side of the hill. And when you entered this bunker, there was like a workshop and areas where tools were and so on.
On the walls, 21 photos of young women in various stages of undress. At the back of the workshop area, detectives found a false wall. Behind it, another sobering surprise.
There was like a cell area that had been built into the back of the bunker, in which we later learned that they would keep female captives there for a period of time before killing them.
They discovered the dungeon and the false room, which is hidden, and the two-way mirror and where the women had been kept.
Investigators meticulously searched the 2-acre property used as the pair's killing grounds.
They discovered 2 5-gallon drums which had been buried, one of which contains IDs, paraphernalia, for up to 25 people who might have been missing. And the other one contains Lake's journals for 1983 and 1984 and the videotapes of the victims.
Appallingly, the video showed in vivid detail the depths of depravity that Lake and Ing indulged in.
You can see how the victims are full of fear and just horrified. And I think they got off on that. That brings it to a whole new level. It was on a horrific level why you would want to tape this stuff. But if you view those tapes, they're quite disturbing.
Brenda O'Connor, she had a little baby. And on the video, she is repeatedly distraught and asking Leonard Lake and Charles Ing, "What have you done with my baby? Where's my baby?" It's very difficult to watch.
But that wasn't all. During the search of the grounds, investigators made a gruesome discovery: human remains.
My partner, Jeff Brosh, pretty much stayed up in Calaveras, and he worked with the detectives up there. And what they were doing at that point was uncovering a lot of evidence that had been buried. We know, of course, that the videos and the gun and the journals had been buried, and they began finding more bodies.
You can see that as their killing went along, in the beginning they're very organised, they're kind of sticking to the rules that they've made up. But towards the end, they are getting quite careless, they are getting quite sloppy. And we are able to identify particular victims from some of that evidence that they left.
Detectives found buried in shallow graves what they thought to be at least 11 bodies, as well as fragments that suggested there was a 12th body. Lake and Ing had disposed of all the evidence they thought might lead back to them.
And what Lake and Ing did is they buried all the contents of their neighbor's cabin in the trench and covered it up. They wanted the authorities to think that Brenda O'Connor, who was the woman with her baby, and her boyfriend and a friend, Scott Stapley, had just left the area and moved on.
The detectives were both identifying the victims whilst at the same time trying to determine the cause of death.
They definitely shot people. They also, in addition to burying a lot of the bodies, they chopped them up and put them in piles and burned them. One of the things that the detectives up in Calaveras were finding a lot of were little small bone chips that had previously been burned. believe they had a big bonfire. So in some of the cases, it's hard to definitely determine what the exact cause of death was, because the bodies had been so badly burned and chopped up.
In all, the team gathered 45 pounds of charred remains. They belong to at least 11 victims killed in the 11-month spree, including 6 men, 3 women, and 2 babies. All had been identified.
Ingham Lake, one of the most unusual things is that they were said to have fed some of the remains of their victims to chickens, of all things. It actually makes a kind of perverse sense. If you've burnt a body, you're left mainly with bone, it can be ground up, and that's the sort of thing a chicken could eat.
Now that investigators knew about the terrible crimes that Lake and Ing had callously committed, they had to catch the fugitive serial killer, Charles Ing.
Ing leaves and crosses the border into Canada, Calgary, and to where his sister lives.
Leonard Lake had committed suicide, but his serial killing partner Charles Ing was still alive, and detectives were now determined to catch him. It would not take long. Over 1,200 miles away, and less than a month after he fled San Francisco, Ing would succumb to his shoplifting urges once again. This time, it would lead to the serial killer's demise. July the 6th, 1985, Calgary, Canada. The net was closing in on Charles Ing.
Based upon information one of his associates had given to the FBI, we felt he probably had gone across the border up into Canada. So his picture was being distributed up there.
Now, Canada, the FBI has international offices in Canada, so when somebody like Ing flees there, the FBI can be on it fairly quickly.
Less than a month after he fled the San Francisco Bay Area, Charles Ing fatefully succumbed to one of his urges.
That strain of kleptomania that had run through his childhood didn't disappear in adulthood. And indeed, it was Ing's kleptomania that in the end saw him caught and brought to justice. And it's almost pathetic. He goes and he steals a can of salmon in a supermarket.
And a couple of store detectives approached him, and he was armed, and he pulled out his gun and shot one of the store clerks.
The security guard manages to hang on to him despite having been shot in the hand, and the police are called. Ing is taken, and then, almost immediately, they realise that they have the man that the American authorities want.
But getting Ing back to the United States to face justice would take years of litigation.
Ing actually committed a crime in Canada, so he has to face justice in Canada like any other criminal would before they're willing to consider sending him to the US.
Charles Ing was sentenced to 4.5 years for attempted murder and shoplifting. He served his time in Canada and he fought tooth and nail to stay in the country.
Ing knew how to make the process work for him, and delaying. He told one of his cellmates, I think, that all I have to do is fire my lawyers and I get another extension. And so he tried that a few times. So he really was able to sit in that Canadian jail and really work the system.
When you look at Ing's behaviour when he's facing these really serious charges, it's still me. He's only concerned about himself. He's trying to dodge extradition. He's trying to kind of create a bit of drama around his case. So now that he's incarcerated, he loses quite a lot of control over many things in his life, but he will cling on to those last vestiges of power. So the things that he can exert control over, he's going to.
6 years later, in 1991, Ing was finally sent to California to answer for his crimes and those of his serial killing partner, Leonard Lake.
By now, he's become very adept indeed at the ways of the law, and he starts a series of battles with the Californian state authorities.
And if you look at some of his behaviour at this time, it's incredibly arrogant, it's very narcissistic. He's complaining about the length of the commute to the courthouse. He's moaning about the food. He's complaining about a whole host of things that he feels wronged by, that he feels entitled to. So here's somebody who really can't see beyond the end of their own nose.
In California, Charles Ng continued his fight to stay out of the courts for another 7 painstaking years.
It took a long time. It was to the families. It was a frustrating time.
He's not going to make a very easy time of it for the people who are looking after him in prison, and he's going to be a nightmare for his lawyers and the legal teams that are involved in this.
By the time Charles Ng faced trial in October 1998, Leonard Lake had been dead for 13 years. But he had left a series of diaries written in his own hand and found at the scene of the crime. After they deciphered some coded entries, investigators were certain that Lake had committed several murders on his own.
Many of these crimes were referred to in code. He would code name different planned killings or crimes with names. One was Fish, Operation Fish, and we finally determined that in addition to the women that Lake and Ng had kidnapped and raped, there was a crime, several murders that Leonard Lake had committed before he and Charles Ng hooked up for their 11-month crime spree.
Acting alone, Lake likely murdered his brother in early 1983. Donald Lake had disappeared in April of that year. Lake's best man, Charles Gunner, vanished in 1983 too, but the exact date he was killed is still a mystery. But just 1 month before Ng went on trial, in September 1998, Charles Gunner's body was found buried on the 2-acre property, 15 years after the fact.
We did find, kind of inadvertently found Charles Gunner's body up on the property, and it was when I think it was a phone company or PG&E crew came through doing work that some of their equipment unearthed Charles Gunner's grave.
Long gone, Lake would never face trial for the crimes he had committed, but his serial killing partner Charles Ng would. On October the 26th, 1998, in the Santa Ana, California courthouse, 14 years after his killing spree began, Ng finally faced trial. To secure a conviction, a 36-foot-long truck full of evidence was ferried 400 miles south to the courtroom in Orange County in Southern California. Having found what they assumed to be 12 burnt bodies, Ng was being prosecuted on 12 counts of murder.
The evidence was so overwhelming. When you consider the fact that you had him on film with a number of the victims telling them that he was going to kill them, along with all of the other evidence that was found, it was a pretty rock-solid case. I went down to Orange County and testified. And in fact, he never made eye contact with me, and I never saw him really make eye contact with anybody else. He just kind of looked down the entire time.
In February 1999, nearly 17 years after the serial killers began their murderous pursuits, Charles Ng was convicted on 11 counts of homicide. The jury found him guilty of murdering 6 men, 3 women, and 2 infant children. They deadlocked on the 12th count. There was simply not enough evidence for the jury to convict him.
He's convicted of killing 11, including 2 infants, 3 women, and 6 men. Ng is sentenced to death, but he's now on death row in San Quentin.
When, if ever that ever happens, is anybody's guess. But that's where he is. But at least he's locked away. I don't think he'll ever get out.
More than 30 years on, and the memories of the mass murders perpetrated by partners Leonard Lake and Charles Ng still plague the homicide detectives who worked on the case.
After a while, you become somewhat hardened, I guess, but when you're dealing with small children or babies, they're just innocent people taken advantage of and abducted. And then you see the horror that they go through. Then to actually see a woman begging for her baby and asking for her baby, that's very unusual and very difficult to deal with.
When I look at the Lake and Inn case, we've got a meeting of two incredibly twisted minds here, and together they created this alternative, depraved reality. But I think the scariest thing is these two weren't mad, they weren't crazy, they knew exactly what they were doing, and yet they chose to do it anyway. And the thought of people deciding and choosing to do the things they did really does chill me to the bone.
It's, you know, a really good thing that shoplifting incident happened, because that's what was the domino that fell to start the whole process, or else these guys may still be out there.
The suicide of Leonard Lake and the conviction of Charles Ing finally brought an end to the serial killing spree. But the lessons learned by investigators will hopefully help them catch and convict the next murderous pair before they too join the ranks of the world's most evil killers. In February 1988, 29-year-old carpenter John Duffy was on trial for rape and the murder of 3 women. He was one half of a terrifying duo who'd become infamous across London. The newspapers had dubbed them the Railway Killers.
As one victim later said, they were like 2 bodies with 1 brain. They knew exactly what the other one was going to do. Their bond was unique and wicked.
After receiving 6 life sentences, Duffy still refused to give up the name of his accomplice, a 29-year-old father of 4 named David Mulcahy.
I think Mulcahy is somebody who returns to a normal life and has absolutely no problem in doing that. He doesn't feel bad about what he's done, and it's very much about self-preservation for him.
But over a decade later, Mulcahy was still free, and Duffy had had enough. He finally confessed to all his crimes and told investigators he would testify against his former friend.
It was almost as if he considered this was an act of betrayal of what was a unique and wicked bond for decades. These were so poles apart now across the courtroom.
John Duffy and David Mulcahy had made their mark as 2 of the world's most evil killers. Two rapists struck fear into the hearts of women across London. When John Duffy was arrested in November 1986, it brought an end to an horrific 4-year crime spree across the British capital. But it would be another 15 years before Duffy's accomplice, David Mulcahy, was found guilty for his part in the heinous crimes. Between them, the deadly duo were responsible for over 20 rapes and 3 murders. It was Duffy's testimony at Mulcahy's trial in the year 2000 that helped to incarcerate his one-time friend.
As the judge delivered the sentence, Mulcahy gave no reaction, staring straight ahead. The judge told him these were sadistic killings, and of the 2 of you, I have no doubt it was you who derived gratification from the act of killing.
One of the lead detectives charged with catching the so-called railway killers was Charlie Farquhar. His son Simon remembers the case well.
These women had their lives disfigured by these 2 men. 3 women lost their lives to these 2 men. Nothing can ever atone for that, and it's a pretty grim thing to immerse yourself in for a period of time.
Over 30 years after the murders, Simon has penned a book about the hunt and capture of Duffy and Mulcahy.
Once I started to really delve into it and really investigate it, I realised I was completely unprepared for just how horrific a case like this actually is. Unlike police officers who have all kinds of defences built up over years and years to deal with these sort of things, I did wander into this as a bit of an innocent, and it does still really haunt me.
The story of these 2 killers begins half a century ago. John Duffy was born in 1958 and David Mulcahy in 1959, on separate sides of the Irish Sea.
Well, both Duffy and Mulcahy are from Catholic families, Irish Catholic families. Duffy was actually born in the Republic of Ireland and came over to England with his family when his father was looking for work. Mulcahy was born in England, and he was the son of a man who went on to become a pub landlord.
In 1970, the two 11-year-old boys struck up a friendship while attending Haverstock School in North London.
I think that Duffy and Mulcahy came together for a variety of different reasons. They were both from Irish families, and the Irish community were still suffering quite a lot of discrimination at this point in time in British society. Also, there was a sense in which they could be a partnership, because Duffy, he was quite short, he had red hair, he was bullied at school, but Mulcahy was bigger, he was broader, and he could be his protector, essentially. So it was quite a brotherhood, really, rather than any kind of casual friendship, and it was them against the rest of the world.
By the age of 13, both boys were already displaying signs of disturbing behaviour.
Well, Mulcahy was suspended from school after he and Duffy were found essentially playing a version of cricket, but using a live hedgehog. And they were found after they'd been engaging in this, and Duffy was covered in blood, and he was laughing at Mulcahy, who was also covered in blood. So this really is quite a warning signal. It's basically a complete lack of empathy for the feelings of this living creature that they were tormenting. And they're starting to experiment here. Their behaviour is starting to escalate, and it really is quite a significant red flag.
They became fascinated with each other's company. They would haunt Hampstead Heath wearing Halloween masks and jump out and frighten courting couples who used to meet on Hampstead Heath, terrify them, and they took enormous pleasure from it.
So these two, they're really having the time of their lives doing this. They're really enjoying having that power over others. But I think to come across them out there in the park in the dark would have been really, really frightening.
As the two teenagers became young men, Duffy and Mulcahy's scare tactics took a criminal turn.
So in their case, you started with the pranks. It moved on to burglary and car theft. They stole the cars again. They didn't steal the car because they want to sell the car. It wasn't for profit. They stole the car because they wanted to drive around and they wanted to have fun.
But then we see that escalate. We see that their physical violence angle kind of start to come out a little bit more. So we hear stories of them shooting at people in the street with an air pistol.
The pair found work at Westminster City Council, Duffy as a carpenter and Mulcahy as a plumber. On one job, Mulcahy had spotted a woman who he thought needed to be taught a lesson. He and Duffy went to her house after dark, intent on raping the woman.
So Duffy and Mulcahy break into the house and lay in wait for the woman whose house Mulcahy's been decorating. But the woman, thankfully, doesn't come home that night. She's gone to a friend's. This infuriates both Duffy and Mulcahy.
So you've got a plan developing here. They're starting to actually decide, well, this is what we're going to do. This isn't something that's opportunistic. This is something that's very much premeditated.
Duffy and Mulcahy were undeterred. They tried the same plan again with a different woman, but escaped from her house when she returned home with a man.
And they probably talk about, say, look, the thing about breaking into people's houses and waiting for them is no good because we don't know if they're gonna come back. We don't know if they're gonna come back with somebody else. So instead of that, how about we actually drive around, find someone, see someone on the street, and then we pounce on them on a dark alley or something like that. So I think the rush that they got from breaking into the house just motivate them to go and do the real thing.
By 1980, both men were in their early 20s and married, but their lust for rape remained. 2 years later, they were ready to strike.
In October 1982, they found the first one. 21-year-old girl coming back from a party, carrying a teddy bear. They put a knife to her throat and forced her into a garden of an empty house. They said, I think it was Duffy who said, "Don't worry, we only want the teddy bear." Nothing could have been further from the truth. They stripped the girl, gagged her, blindfolded her, and raped her.
From then on, the attacks became incredibly prolific. At one point, there was 3 in one night. They would generally drive around together, listening to music to psych themselves up. They carried with them a kit of balaclavas or masks. Mulcahy would put gaffer tape inside his jacket, which would then be used to gag the victims. He'd often blindfold them as well.
Paul Cheston from the Evening Standard newspaper recalls the fear felt across the capital.
That added to the sense of terror felt by Londoners that it was almost a military-style operation, and the planning that was going into it was much more than just spur of attack, moment attacks.
Mulcahy would always ask the victims their names and addresses as well, and would often steal items which had their address on, library cards, that sort of thing. The idea was that if these victims went to the police, we will find you, you know, and so on. They always made sure their victims were reduced to a state of abject terror.
One such attack occurred in the summer of 1984.
The attack on the 2 Danish au pairs took place in July 1984. That night, Duffy and Mulcahy had been driving around for a long time, unable to find a victim. And finally, they saw these 2 18-year-old girls walking along Spaniards Road on the edge of Hampstead Heath. They'd been out in the West End and missed the last train home and were walking back. They decided to attack them both. Duffy had a replica gun, and Mulcahy had a knife. They were dragged off the road and onto the heath and brutally assaulted.
For 3 years, Duffy and Mulcahy continued undetected.
In late 1985, the police had connected 24 attacks on women in North London, and posters went up across London for the North London rapists. They knew they were looking for 2 men, a shorter man and a taller one. They didn't know a great deal about the taller man, but they knew that the shorter man was an A-secretor blood group, had fair hair. The taller man they knew a lot less about. He had a darker complexion, he had a mole on his chin, he had mousy brown hair and was about 5'11" tall, and was much more violent than the shorter man.
The majority of the attacks had taken place in the vicinity of train stations. The press had dubbed them the railway rapists.
It was a very big story in London. There was a widespread concern, not just because rapists were loose, but because they were finding victims in and around railway stations. And London has millions of Londoners travel on public transport, and it was a serious concern for Londoners.
But it was about to get worse. Their next victim would not just be raped, she would be murdered. By December 1985, John Duffy and David Mulcahy had been sexually assaulting women in and around railway stations in London for over 3 years. Still undetected by the police, their confidence was growing.
I think it was inevitable that this was only going to escalate further, because we've got 2 men here who are really enjoying the sexual violence that they've been perpetrating. And often when you look at offenders who are engaged in this kind of behaviour, they're not going to just stop at a particular level. They want to keep upping the ante. So I think murder was unfortunately inevitable here.
On December the 29th, 1985, Alison Day caught a train to Hackney Wick Station to meet her fiancé.
Alison Day was a 19-year-old secretary who lived in Upminster with her parents. She'd been adopted as a baby and brought into a very, very loving household. She worked as a secretary in a local solicitor's office. She was enormously bubbly and popular, and she just got engaged.
But Alison never completed her journey.
At that time, obviously, it was a torture for her parents, not knowing if she'd just run away, although it seemed absolutely, implausible that she had. What had actually happened was that she'd got the train to Hackney Wick, and Duffy and Mulcahy were waiting for her on the platform. They could quite easily have walked her out of the station, but instead they decided to walk her across the live rail tracks, down the railway siding, and then under the railway bridge. There they both committed horrific attacks on her. And at this point, as far as Duffy was aware, the plan was to leave Alison on the far side of the bridge and then make their escape. But Mulcahy wanted to do something more than that, so he made her walk along the outside ledge of the bridge. She couldn't swim. It was also at 1 degree below freezing, and she fell into the River Lee, screaming out that she couldn't swim. She waded to the edge and Duffy helped her out, and then she managed to run. She ran for her life, and this enraged Mulcahy. And Mulcahy yelled out, "Get the bitch, John, get her."
Duffy caught up with Alison, but Mulcahy's slip of the tongue had sealed her fate.
He said to Duffy, "We have to do this because she's seen us and she knows your name now."
He cuts up the blouse she's wearing and uses it to strangle her. And he says to Duffy, "You turn the tourniquet one more time just so that we're in it together."
Alison was begging and pleading for her life, and her last words were, "Please, it's only the moustache I've seen. I won't tell anyone. Do not hurt me." Just unbelievable. She was strangled, rolled into the river, and then they both drove back. Duffy was panicking. Mulcahy said, "We would have been done for attempted murder anyway. It's got to be, that's just the way it is." He dropped Duffy off. Mulcahy picked his children up, went back home, and Alison Day was dead.
The 19-year-old's body was found 3 weeks later, face down in a canal. The railway rapists had become the railway killers. Duffy and Mulcahy had strangled Alison to death using a tourniquet.
I think when we're looking at the murder of Alison Day and we hear about them twisting the tourniquet together, basically what they're doing here is saying, we're in this together, we've both done this, you can't blame it on me, I can't blame it on you. So there is that pact going back to their school days when they said they're not going to grass on each other. That really is the kind of cementing of that.
Less than 6 months later, Duffy and Mulcahy struck again. This time their victim was even younger.
Marty Tamboza was a Dutch schoolgirl. She just celebrated her 15th birthday. On Thursday the 17th of April, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, after coming home from school, she had something to eat, had a drink, and then got on her bike to cycle into the village to buy some sweets from the shop. Her mum said to her, as she always did, "Don't take the railway path because it's very quiet along there. Take the long way round." Marty, being a teenage girl, thought it'll be all right, and she took the railway path, and Duffy and Mulcahy were waiting at the end of it for her.
Marcia was raped by both men in the woods near Horsley Station. Mulcahy used a rock to knock the 15-year-old schoolgirl unconscious, and then made the decision that she had to die.
He then instructs Duffy that he has to kill her. "After all, I killed the first one. You've got to kill the second one." And they take her belt, put it round her neck, and they stick a stick through the belt to tighten the pressure on her neck. And they do indeed kill the poor 15-year-old. Innocent, had done nothing more than ride her bicycle, and she'd done nothing to these two men. It was an absolutely abhorrent, depraved, disgraceful crime.
Once Duffy had killed Marty Tamboza, Mulcahy ran up to him and said, "Well done, you've done good." And almost like he was the captain of a football team, congratulating a new player. He then told Duffy to go back to the station and said he would see him there. He said he wanted to go back to the body to make sure there were no fingerprints left on the rock. He actually went back to make sure that she was dead and to make a pretty vile attempt to destroy any forensic evidence there was by setting fire to her.
Marcia's body was found in the woods the following day.
The sight that greeted those police officers was absolutely horrific. She'd been savagely raped, submitted to brutal head injuries, strangled, and the body had been set on fire in a clear attempt to destroy forensic evidence. She was lying beside some bluebells, and the police christened the inquiry Operation Bluebell in tribute to her.
Metropolitan Police Detective Charlie Farquhar, who was investigating the murder of Alison Day, contacted his colleagues in Surrey Police. He believed the two murders were connected.
And when he told Surrey on the phone, Surrey realised that the piece of wood that was lying next to Marty's body wasn't in fact just a piece of wood on the ground. It had actually fallen out of the knots in the rope and obviously was the same murder method. And at that point, this became a joint murder inquiry. Shortly afterwards, the connection was made with the London rapes, and this went from being a small inquiry being run from a porter cabin to the biggest criminal manhunt since the search for the Yorkshire Ripper.
Duffy and Mulcahy didn't wait long to claim their third victim. On May the 18th, 1986, recently married Anne Locke boarded a train for Brookman's Park Station in Hertfordshire, but she never made it home.
Anne Locke was 29 years old. She was a bright, attractive girl with a huge amount of talent and future in broadcasting. She was a secretary at London Weekend Television, and she was in love. She'd been married just 4 weeks earlier, had returned from a dream honeymoon in the Seychelles, where she'd gone scuba diving. She still had a suntan from that lovely holiday, and she disappeared.
Paul Dockley from Hertfordshire Police led the inquiry into Anne's disappearance.
The weirdest thing was that the initial officers attending this missing person inquiry discovered that her bike was missing, and in fact we found it behind the shed, leant up against a tree, which was unusual to say the least. And so we started searching. We started searching around the railway station. We also did a trawl of people that may have been on the train coming out of London on that particular night.
It was the latest twist in a story that had captivated the British public.
The disappearance of Anne Locke was a media sensation that summer, the missing bride story as it was called.
And the headlines about missing bride escalated. The speculation became more frenzied about what could have happened to her. They were already piecing her disappearance to the two previous murders, and there was a tangible air of, what are the police doing? They cannot even find a body, let alone find the people responsible.
But the police had little to go on. They could not even be sure that Anne had reached Brookman's Park Station.
The first time that the police genuinely realised that Anne was probably dead was when Inspector Paul Dockley was searching the area. And even though the search was massive, the search was generally at ground level, and being a good detective, he looked up, and up in the trees, cradled in the branches, was Anne's diary.
I didn't know it was Anne's diary immediately, but I saw it in the tree, so we recovered that. And within the next day, we reasserted our search in that area and recovered her purse, her LWT pass, and her address book. So at that point, which was probably 4 weeks into the inquiry, we knew at that point that Anne had returned to Brookman's Park.
And just a week later, the police found out the devastating truth of what had happened to 29-year-old Anne.
Eventually, after 9 weeks, the search was called off. The police had gone to the edge of the Hertfordshire boundary and still couldn't find anything. And then a few days later, some railway workers found her body just into the Metropolitan Police District, dreadfully decomposed.
Following the discovery of Anne Locke's body, we actually developed a joint investigation with Hertfordshire, the Met, Surrey and British Transport Police. Investigating a murder is almost like starting a jigsaw puzzle with a piece of blue sky, because you do not know the pattern of how things have occurred. You're faced with a scene, but it doesn't actually tell you necessarily who the offender is. So you're working through that jigsaw of trying to put together all the elements in order to prove a case. And it's hard as a detective to detach yourself from what you actually see. You're dealing with this on a regular basis, but I don't think I've ever come across a case like this.
As one victim later said, they were like two bodies with one brain. They knew exactly what the other one was going to do. If they split up and ran in different directions, they knew where they were going to meet up, and so on. Their bond was unique and wicked.
While police from 3 regions searched for them, Duffy and Mulcahy remained hidden in plain sight, married men with regular jobs. But the net was closing in on the pair. In the summer of 1986, Hertfordshire, Surrey and London's Metropolitan Police forces were working together to try and capture the 2 men the papers were calling the railway killers. But the evidence they had was minimal.
So this was the 1980s. Forensic science was still in its infancy compared to the advances that have been made since. It wasn't just forensic science, which was in quite a primitive state at the time. Also, police treatment of sexual crimes wasn't as sophisticated as understanding as it is now.
The surviving victims had provided investigators with descriptions of their attackers. They knew that one of the rapists was tall and violent, the other short with piercing blue eyes. Forensic evidence suggested that the shorter man had the blood group A.
We were literally going through a list of people that could be possible offenders called the Z-men. And the Z-men had been previously arrested, and you've got to remember this is pre-DNA, so we're the precursor to DNA, and we were looking at A secretors, so people who secreted in their blood or their saliva or semen an A secretor factor.
The Z-Men had over 2,000 people in it. John Duffy was on it because of a serious assault on his wife the previous year. He was number 1,595 on that list. And it was just a case of working through the list and interviewing every single one of those men. Eventually, number 1595 came up and it was time for him to be questioned. He sat down, was quite polite and cooperative, but behaved rather strangely. He was trying to be much too helpful, and his answers were rather glib. The two police officers interviewing him had an uneasy feeling. They left the room and said to each other, this could be him, not least because of these piercing blue eyes he had, which many of the rape victims had commented on, the shorter man having very piercing blue eyes.
Despite their suspicions, Duffy was released, but before long, he was back.
The two investigators rang me and said, Governor, you won't believe this. He said, last night, John Duffy presented himself at West Hampstead Police Station. He'd been slashed across the chest with a blade, and he was saying that he had amnesia. They took him to his home address. He didn't recognise his mum, his dad, his dog, nothing. And he was taken to Free and Barnet Hospital, where he was sectioned.
The investigation had taken a bizarre twist. Duffy was still a suspect, but the police were not permitted to talk to him while he was sectioned.
So Duffy was at Free and Barnet Hospital, and we weren't allowed to interview him for at least 8 weeks. And unbeknown to us, we thought he was in a secure unit at Free and Barnet Hospital. In actual fact, he was allowed to come and go.
Duffy had been attacking on his own since mid-1984, and unlike Mulcahy, didn't possess the same level of self-control. He was becoming wildly unstable, and he also took a lot more risks when he was carrying out these attacks and was much more careless.
And unfortunately, he went out to a railway line and raped a young girl whilst he was in the care of Free and Barnet Hospital.
The last attack he committed when he knew the police were closing in on him was on a 14-year-old schoolgirl in Watford. And during that attack, her blindfold slipped and she saw him very clearly. When Duffy was arrested, that girl walked into the ID parade and walked straight up and pointed him out. And at that point, that was the end for John Duffy.
He said nothing. He said no comment to everything. He didn't deny anything, he just said no comment. Now, he would talk to me about martial arts as long as the day. You know, he was quite happy to talk about that. But anything to do with rape, missing girls, murders, not interested. And of course, his answer was, I've been in hospital, I've had amnesia. I don't remember anything. I don't remember anything before going into hospital.
Detectives knew they needed some solid evidence if they were going to charge Duffy with murder. And the string that he and Mulcahy had used to tie up Marcia Tamboza 7 months earlier was about to give them just that.
They used a particular piece of string that was called some yarn, and a lot of us will think string is string is string. But when you get down to the forensic detail, how it's made, what it's made of, all of these things can be very different. And if you happen to use a very unusual piece of string, it's going to help identify where that's come from.
And the company said this is a very unusual piece of string because it's been taken from the end of the yarn. So basically it's on a loom and it's cut, and this is an end piece. And they said to us, if you can find the ball of string, we could do a match. So the search team, who went to Duffy's parents' address, searched the outside toilet, and in a bucket in there was a ball of some yarn.
It was enough to finally put an end to the murderous career of one of the railway killers.
Gradually, the evidence is building up against Duffy, and he was charged with the murder of Anne Locke, in addition to the murder of Alison Day, Marty Tamboza, and a number of rapes.
Investigators were certain that Duffy's accomplice was his oldest friend, David Mulcahy.
He was actually arrested 4 times over the next few months. Every time that the police got another break, they brought him in again, but eventually realised there just wasn't enough evidence. There was no forensic evidence to connect him with the crimes at all. When they searched his vehicles, they found in the cab of his van masking tape, balaclavas, all sorts of things that incriminated him, but none of it was enough.
But his name was known to the press, and a lot of people, a lot of pressmen went to see him, just to gauge what sort of reaction he would give. Of course, there was no reaction, there was even no comment, and he got increasingly angry about what he called was harassment. But the press knew that there were 2 people involved in the railway rapist cases, and Duffy's friend was the prime suspect.
John Duffy would go to trial alone, and there was more bad news for investigators. The judge instructed the jury to dismiss the murder charge of Anne Locke due to a lack of evidence.
This caused a lot of anguish with Anne Locke's family and a lot of surprise amongst the press. But the problem was that in the Locke case, there was no surviving victim to give any evidence. There were no witnesses to the attack. The fact that the body had been laid unfound for 2 months meant there was no DNA evidence.
In February 1988, John Duffy's trial began at the Old Bailey in London.
John Duffy walked into the witness box at the Old Bailey and put up one of the worst defences ever heard by an Old Bailey jury to suggest that he was suffering from amnesia and could remember nothing about what happened during the period in which he is accused of the murders and rapes was frankly an insult to the intelligence of anyone in court, let alone the jury. His whole body language was of defiance. I am going to give you nothing. I am standing here, sticking to my story, and I don't care. And the piercing eyes that his victims spoke of, the wild, staring blue eyes, absolutely radiated out from the witness box across the court.
Duffy was found guilty of 2 murders and 5 rapes. He was given 6 life sentences, but despite everything, he refused to give up the name of his accomplice and best friend.
Well, maybe the reason why Duffy kept quiet right at the beginning, they had the agreement that they had from a very young age, and they never broke that agreement. We're never going to rat on each other. So when he went to prison, he probably decided, I'm going to stay true because I am, a good friend, or I am the man I am, or whatever. I'm true to my word.
As Duffy's sentence began, David Mulcahy remained a free man. The married father of 4 set up his own decorating business, and life went on as normal.
I think Mulcahy is somebody who returns to a normal life and has absolutely no problem in doing that. And that's because he can switch. He can flip very easily because he doesn't feel empathy for his victims. He doesn't feel bad about what he's done. And it's very much about self-preservation for him.
Everybody knew that David Mulcahy was the second man, but he honestly thought that he got away with that. And for the next 10 years, he pretty much had.
But as Duffy's time in prison passed by, something inside of him clicked. After claiming to be suffering from amnesia, he suddenly got his memory back. By 1999, he was ready to talk and tell the police all about his accomplice, David Mulcahy. 11 years after his conviction, John Duffy was in prison serving 6 life sentences for his part in a series of rapes and murders in and around London between 1982 and 1986. But Duffy's partner in crime, David Mulcahy, remained free.
Mulcahy was the one who first suggested, let's break into the girl's house. He was the one who first suggested, let's go and find victims on the street. And he was the one who first suggested, let's commit murder. But the one who was paying all the price was Duffy. So it's very, very easy for you to see that after 10 years, the little fuse from Duffy got to an end. And he was like, forget it, I'm gonna come and clean.
In 1997, Duffy, who had originally claimed to be suffering from amnesia about the crimes, had begun visiting a prison psychologist.
So basically, Duffy had been in prison for 10 years and thought this is an opportunity to talk and talk and talk. And basically, he told the psychologist about the offences he had committed and the fact that he hadn't committed them alone.
During their conversations, Duffy reveals that he committed his crimes with another person, and she casually asks which prison his co-defendant is in, and Duffy drops the bombshell. He's not in prison, he was never caught. She says, I have to tell the police about this, which Duffy agrees to, and so she tells the police. John Duffy's just named his accomplice. It's someone called David Mulcahy.
It was a big breakthrough for detectives who'd been trying to bring Mulcahy to justice for over a decade. And a huge slice of fortune was about to initiate his downfall.
There's an extraordinary coincidence here. At the same time that this was going on, a similar series of attacks was taking place on Hampstead Heath, and police began to suspect that David Mulcahy may have become active again. They had a DNA profile for the attacker. Mulcahy was brought in, questioned, they took his DNA and it didn't match. And once again, he left the police station, very cocky, very arrogant.
But the police now had Mulcahy's DNA on file. They had to go back 15 years to find a match.
Amazingly, in deep storage was the clothing of the Danish au pairs raped on Hampstead Heath in 1984. And when the clothing was run through forensics, one sample of clothing had Duffy's DNA on it and the other had David Mulcahy's DNA. And suddenly, after all those years of thinking he got away with it, suddenly that case had come back to haunt him.
On February the 6th, 1999, David Mulcahy was taken into custody. He would never be free again.
As soon as I found out that the police had arrested and charged a new suspect in the railway rapist cases, I, like every other pressman who had been in any sort of involvement in the case, immediately knew that it had to be David Mulcahy.
He thought they were just clutching at straws. He thought that this was just another attempt to arrest him, which was going to fall through. When they sat down to question him, the first thing they asked him was about the night of the 15th of July 1984 in the company of John Duffy. And he wasn't expecting this at all. And then the police revealed that they'd found his DNA on an exhibit from that crime. And the odds of it being another person other than him were 1 in 1 billion, at which point a police officer had to hold up the waste paper basket because he was violently sick. He realised that the game was up.
Mulcahy's trial was set for October 2000, and the prosecution had a surprise witness lined up. John Duffy was ready to testify against his former friend. He had admitted to detectives that the pair had killed all 3 women, including Anne Locke.
Duffy couldn't be retried for the murder of Anne Locke because at that time there was still in force something called the double jeopardy rule, which means you can't be tried for the same crime twice. It was a silly law which is now gone, but Duffy said himself at the time, if I could be tried again for this one, I would be. So there was never any point where he was trying to minimise his involvement.
After it seemed like he was going to get away with murder, the gathered press were excited to finally see Mulcahy on trial. Paul Cheston was in the courtroom throughout.
The Mulcahy trial was unquestionably the trial of the year at the Old Bailey. There was huge anticipation at reopening this historic case dating back almost 15 years. And as always, when the case opens and the defendant is brought in, everyone's eyes just immediately shift straight to the dock. You look more like a bank manager than a serial killer. And he immediately set about giving an air of relaxed, as if this was just a formality that would be thrown out of court straight away.
On November the 6th, 2000, John Duffy entered the courtroom to give evidence against his former friend and accomplice.
There was huge anticipation, a real frisson in court when John Duffy shuffled in through the judge's entrance, not through the main entrance, because he was a Category A prisoner, the first Category A prisoner, serving life murderer, to give evidence for the Crown at the Old Bailey. And when he entered court, he shuffled. He had his head down. He would mumble. The piercing eyes were hooded. He didn't want to look up.
The tension in the courtroom between the two killers was palpable. Duffy avoided eye contact with Mulcahy.
It was almost as if he considered this was an act of betrayal and he couldn't look in that direction. He didn't want to catch Mulcahy's eye. Meanwhile, Mulcahy in the dock was acting as if he'd never met him and this was some complete stranger. And he was scribbling notes and this and that, and they seemed bizarre that what was a unique and wicked bond for decades, these were so poles apart now across the courtroom.
True to his word, Duffy gave a detailed account of the duo's career of rape and murder.
His accounts, particularly of Alison Day pleading for mercy, with Mulcahy claiming we're going to have to kill her because she's seen us, and Alison Day saying, I've only seen the moustache, don't do this to me, don't hurt me, I won't tell anybody. And Mulcahy, in Duffy's words, twisting the tourniquet and throttling her to death. That for the first and only time, John Duffy showed a glimmer of remorse. His eyes welled up, his voice faltered, the judge called a halt, he was led away, the case was adjourned for 10-15 minutes.
Duffy gave testimony across 2 weeks of the 5-month murder trial. On February the 2nd, 2001, the jury had made a decision on the fate of David Mulcahy.
And when the jury foreman was asked to go through on each count on this long indictment and answered the first verdict, you find Mulcahy guilty or not guilty, answered guilty, there was such an escape of emotion and like steam from a kettle of relief. And then it went through the indictment, guilty, 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 guilty.
And when it came to the verdict on Anne Locke, because this had been a case that Duffy had been found not guilty of because of the lack of evidence, this was finally the chance to really lay this to rest. And when a guilty came in on that as well, the atmosphere was extraordinary in that court.
And there was a lot of victims families in court, an inevitable outbreak of relief, of tears. Mulcahy himself seemed entirely unmoved, it's almost as if he expected it. And it was an extraordinary scene at the Old Bailey, even by the Old Bailey standards.
And David Mulcahy had nothing else, no other way of hurting those victims anymore. So as he walked out of the dock, he looked over at 2 of the victims sitting in the public gallery and smirked at them. It was his last desperate act of revenge. And then that was it. And then he was promptly sentenced to a total of 258 years in prison. So I think we can safely say he's never going to get out.
Sentencing Judge Michael Hyam told Mulcahy these were acts of desolating wickedness. You descended to the depths of depravity.
Finally, 15 years after the murder of Anne Locke, John Duffy and David Mulcahy were both behind bars. 12 years were added to Duffy's sentence, while Mulcahy has still never confessed to any of the crimes.
I think the fact that Mulcahy's always maintained his innocence really is testament to his narcissism. He is protecting the image of himself that he's putting out there to other people. He doesn't want others to believe that he is this individual who's carried out these heinous crimes.
There's always been speculation that Duffy and Mulcahy were guilty of other rapes, some of which will not even have been reported. But thank goodness, at least finally, they were brought to justice.
These were perhaps crimes that they may not have committed had they never met, but they come together and you create the perfect storm.
For 4 years, John Duffy and David Mulcahy targeted vulnerable women in and around London. They callously raped over 20 and murdered 3. One of them a 15-year-old schoolgirl. Although initially detained in 1986, it wasn't until Duffy broke the bond that he and Mulcahy had shared since their childhood that their world of lies fell apart and justice was finally served upon the twisted pair known as the Railway Killers.